today on cannabis-infused beer. What is it? How do you make it? What goes into it? Pretty much everything about it. How do you even sell it? And what the market is looking like right now. I am Aaron Silverstein, the managing director of BevZero. We're a company that works in the non-alcoholic beer and wine space, helping a number of folks actually produce kind of similar products to this through services. Before we get started and go into any further detail, just want to say a big thank you to the sponsors for the Spring Virtual Conference, Precision Fermentation, River Drive Cooperage, and White Labs. Just going to try and give us a little bit of time now for some more folks to join before we kind of really just dive right into this. And feel free to ask any questions while we're going. I'll be checking the comments and happy to answer anything. I think there's a lot of different material to dive into. If you didn't know anything about cannabis before this, you're probably going to know plenty. So just diving right in here, we've got a slide of a number of different beers, or actually you're going to notice you're not going to see the term beer on any of these because that's a bit of a legal difficulty to use. But cannabis-infused products that are out there in the market right now. New Frontier Brewing Company, Two Roots Brewing Company, Outbound, I believe formerly known as High Style at one point actually. Lagunitas High Five Hops, I'm sure Lagunitas is a very familiar name. Cideries Brewing Company, if you're familiar with Blue Moon, the brewer who designed that beer, Keith Villa, is behind Cideries Brewing, as well as Barrel Brothers. I believe they have 2 SKUs right now out of the California marketplace. These are generally in various states. Most of them are in California. Some of them are in Colorado. I believe some are also going to be expanding to Illinois very soon. So we've got a different array of products. And actually something interesting is the Lagunitas Hi-Fi Hops gets a lot of press as being beer, but that is actually a sparkling water that's hop flavored. That's really capitalizing on Lagunitas' relationship with beer. So what we're going to discuss today, what is cannabis-infused beer? Also, what is the deal with CBD? It's something I get a lot of questions and interest in pretty regularly. What is the regulatory environment around cannabis-infused beer or hemp and CBD? How do you make this? And then we're going to dive into what are the challenges behind actually producing and selling this, and what are the opportunities. So the first thing I'd like to dive into is what exactly is cannabis? What are you trying to put into beer here? So cannabis is the plant, Cannabis sativa. The most famous compound related to that is THC, or delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. Kind of a mouthful to say. But that name is actually getting more and more important and relevant, where we're seeing some other compounds come up in the news that are also from that same cannabis plant, but have questionable legality. They may or may not even be federally legal. So you're probably seeing some news articles lately about delta-8 THC, so delta-8 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is almost the same exact thing as delta-9, but it just got a slightly different chemical structure, just the way those molecules are oriented, a little bit different. And that makes it not only legally different, but it also means that it has a different pharmacological effect on the human body. And there's quite a lot of different cannabinoids in the cannabis plant. There's a whole slew of them, and they all have different effects. So that's something we're going to see more and more about as the years go on, with cannabis products getting more popular. What cannabinoids are you putting in each product? What is the concentration, and what do they do? An example that we probably see getting kind of popular in the future is THCV. not something a lot of people have heard of at the moment, but some people talk about it actually suppressing your appetite. So the antithesis of the munchies, even kind of calling it skinny weed. That's a hard thing to get away with on a product for sure, but it's getting awareness and definitely getting popular. So that's something that I think we're going to see even more of, specific cannabinoids in marketing and what that means to the consumer. Now, we're talking about just the plant cannabis, but how do you actually take this plant matter and get into the beverage? Because it's different than just adding pelletized hops. Adding pelletized cannabis is not quite going to work here. There's some talk of people who did this during cannabis prohibition, where they were making products that would be considered illegal still today, where they would be fermenting with cannabis in the product and relying on the alcohol to then kind of solubilize the desirable compounds. Pretty much every state right now is making the combination of cannabis and alcohol illegal in their products by law, but also right now, practically, that's just going to be illegal. Since your bonded brewery is going to be a federal license, that's not really going to be compatible with any kind of state cannabis licensing while that product is federally legal. So to actually take something from that plant matter and put it in a format to go into beverage, there's a few different steps. The first few steps are going to be effectively extraction and distillation. So I need to find a way to take those desirable cannabinoids, separate them from the plant, clean them up, make sure they're in a bioactive form, and then we can figure out how to actually put them into that beverage. So the first step of extraction is where I'm creating what you refer to as a crude oil, taking that cannabis plant matter, and we're usually going to be soaking it in some kind of solvent. So ethanol is really commonly used. That's probably going to be the dominant form factor. I think it is at the moment. Other popular methods are supercritical CO2. So we're effectively using CO2 at a very high pressure, so that almost takes on liquid-like properties and acts as a solvent to then strip the cannabinoids off the plant matter. We've seen propane and butane also used as solvents since they evaporate pretty readily, but those are generally going out of fashion, not necessarily the friendliest stuff to work with, more explosive than ethanol. There are some other cool methods, even like a rosin press, which actually just uses physical pressure, just coming right down on the plant to such a high extent that it's essentially crushing the oils right off the plant material. Now, once we have that crude oil, there's a lot more in that than just the desirable substances we're looking for. So the next step we're going to want to do is winterization and filtration. So in this step, we're going to chill everything, usually pretty cold. I believe like somewhere between -4 degrees Celsius and -80 degrees. So pretty cold for an extended period of time, something like 24 hours, so that we have the heavier particles that we don't want in our end product falling out of solution and kind of forming a separate layer. Our waxes, lipids, chlorophyll, those are going to sink to the bottom, whereas your THC, CBD, or sorry, THCA or CBDA usually in this format are going to rise to the top, and it can then be filtered off and separating those. Once we've kind of winterized everything and cleaned it up, the next step is actually a distillation, which is going to do two things. It's heat that's going into this, which is going to decarboxylate those compounds. So you are taking THCA and converting that into THC because you're removing a carboxyl group from it. Same thing for CBDA, converting into CBD, and a variety of other cannabinoids. And prior to doing that, they are not actually active, right? So That's why if someone were to make cannabis brownies, it's very important that they heat the cannabis in oil or something first in order to do that decarboxylation step. Otherwise, if you're just going to eat straight plant matter, it's not actually going to do anything because it's not in active form. The other important part of distillation is generally we're going to refine this even further because we're going to have those activated cannabinoids. They're going to evaporate and then be recollected in a condensation chamber. So the extent to which you refine this, highly variable. That's up to what equipment you're running and your processing parameters and how clean you want to go. People will go all the way from a distillate to what's referred to as an isolate, implying that it's very pure in one specific cannabinoid. This gets really important for beverages, actually, because this is going to determine what kind of flavor profile that your cannabis distillate or isolate is going to impart to a beverage it's added to. I could have, if I'm doing a more what they refer to as broad spectrum, where I'm not refining this a lot, I'm just distilling it over, and I'm capturing lots of the different terpenes and things like that that are inherent to a strain and carrying that profile over. Or the more pure I go, I'm going to make that neutral. And you can really even get to the point where you're adding something that's not actually impacting or imparting any flavor. Similarly, that can also contribute bitterness and other elements to your beverage. Now, after I've created this distillate, the next step I need to go about and tackle is how to actually be able to put that in a beverage. Because cannabinoids they're all hydrophobic. They're oils. And if you know oil and water, it doesn't really mix, especially in these products where you're not actually allowed to have alcohol in them. So the next step that we're generally going to see, there are some other options, but I'd say this is going to become the dominant form, and something like 95% plus of all cannabis beverages is emulsification. And what that means is I'm taking these cannabinoids, these hydrophobic compounds, and I'm going to make them effectively soluble in water and stable in that format so that I can create a prepackaged beverage and actually sell that on the market without worrying about it separating or having other shelf life issues. So to dive in a little bit into what emulsification is, how does it work? The principle is kind of simple. It's you're creating these droplets that are going to capture the oil within them in the center. So you're seeing in this diagram, you've got particles that will have hydrophobic tails that will surround your desired hydrophobic materials. So the particle has a hydrophobic tail, but then a hydrophilic head. So it surrounds that oil that you want to emulsify and add to a aqueous beverage, and it stabilizes it in water because you've got all those hydrophilic heads that are kind of protecting it, almost like a little submarine of cannabis oil. Once you've created these droplets, then you can add those into a beverage, or sometimes you could actually create them in the beverage at a certain point, and you're going to have a stable product, so long as you've got a stable structure here to back this up. What gets really interesting too is, so what you're using there, the particle that's got a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail, that's called a surfactant. That's really stabilizing this emulsion. Now, depending on the surfactant I'm using, the amount of energy I use to break it up, all these things that, I'll be honest, I'm not the biggest expert in. There's a couple of companies out there right now that are generally providing emulsification as a service, since that gets quite technical to do and difficult to do with quality and consistently. The two large ones out there right now are Vertosa and Source. If you're interested and want to look up those names, I know Vertosa has some great reading available on their site too, actually, if you want to go really in depth into the science of how this works. But depending on the parameters they use, you can adjust things like the droplet size itself, right? So how large that droplet of suspended oil is going to be. And that's going to determine a lot of factors like, is it going to refract light? So the larger it is, the more light it refracts, and that's actually going to make a beverage product cloudy. Whereas if I want high clarity, something transparent, I'm going to need even smaller particles, which are more difficult usually to maintain. Depending on size also, it's going to impact what is the bioavailability. So there's a lot of talk about something called nanoemulsions, where they're taking the droplet size into that nano range under a certain size. And that actually means that it can be absorbed usually sublingually. So all of a sudden I'm taking a cannabis product where, normally you assume if you're going to have any edible cannabis product, it takes a while to work, maybe 2 or 3 hours, something like that. It's got to go into your stomach and digest. It'll actually pass through the liver at some point before it activates. Nanoemulsions in a cannabis beverage, it gets absorbed under your tongue and it goes in an active form directly into your bloodstream. So all of a sudden you can use a lower dose and have a equally potent effect. And you can also have a very quick activation. So instead of 2 or 3 hours, sometimes it's about 10 to 20 minutes. It's a product that's going to get a lot closer to mirroring alcohol, which is definitely a significant value to the consumer. It makes it something that's easier to drink and understand because it mirrors that process of drinking alcohol. It's a similar time frame, 10 to 20 minutes to actually feel effects, as well as you're going to have a quicker kind of cutoff where that hour to 2 hours is where an effect is actually going to start wearing off. So it starts to make these drinks a really sessionable cannabis product and something that consumers are almost already familiar with how to consume. So there's a lot of talk about this being the preferred format for new beverage consumers. The next thing I want to dip into and clarify, because it gets a lot of confusion, is, what is CBD? How is this different from THC in cannabis? And kind of what's the deal with hemp, which is now actually federally legal. So in 2018, the Farm Bill, federal act legalized the production of hemp, specifically defines it as something with delta 9 THC concentration of less than 0.3%. And that makes it a federally legal plant. Even though it's actually the same exact plant species, that's really the only difference with it. That's all that's required to make it federally legal. So all of a sudden, we've got all kinds of CBD products coming into the market now, ever since 2018. We're also hearing about delta 8 THC. So even though it's actually THC, because it doesn't have that delta 9 THC, that makes it legal. And we're getting a lot of press about that right now. However, what also happened in 2018 was that the FDA approved a drug called Epidiolex, which the active ingredient is CBD. So what that means is that the FDA moved CBD into a Schedule 5 drug. So even though the production of it is federally legal, it's regulated by the FDA as a drug. And that means that you can't actually add it to food or beverage right now until the FDA takes further stance on it and decides that's going to be GRAS or some limitations on it. And the TTB has taken up the stance of the FDA. So the TTB is really actually preventing you from using any hemp ingredient other than hemp seeds right now, or hemp seed oil in your products, which means that CBD beer is kind of practically illegal because you're going to be unable to get a certificate of label approval because the TTB will not approve any formula for a product containing ingredients other than hemp seed or hemp seed oil And they will also actually test that for CBD content. It's a bummer since this is obviously something that the market is looking for. And what we're seeing in other beverage categories outside of beer right now is that folks are just labeling things as hemp extract or hemp oil. And in that way, they're generally able to add CBD to their products and sort of skirt the FDA regulations, is what we see to be happening. We're also actually seeing some bad actors who are claiming they're adding CBD to products like seltzer waters, and they're not really doing anything. They've been analyzed for CBD content, and there's nothing in there. So how do you actually produce legal cannabis-infused beer for sale here? What are people doing in at least the cannabis legal markets where you're going through that state licensed market? No state is allowing alcohol in this right now. So it's got to be less than 0.5% ABV. There's a couple different ways you can get there and make beer products in those categories. And we're going to dive into those later. And I'm really happy to answer any questions on that. That is where a lot of my expertise is. I've been working in the non-alcoholic sector for about 4 years now, both in Europe and in the United States. So some ramifications of going into this space is that the infusion and final packaging, labeling, all of that has to occur within the state you're actually going to sell it in, because there is no interstate commerce right now for cannabis. And when we see states where these products can exist, the reason they can skirt around some of the FDA and TTB policy is, let's say in California specifically, for example, a cannabis-infused food or beverage is legally not actually considered a food or a drug. Edible cannabis product is, at least in California, its own category. So it falls under separate regulations, and you've got your health and safety code inspectors are not going to effectively inspect it as if it were a food or a drug. And that's sort of how they seem to be getting around that in intrastate commerce. One of the really interesting parts too about getting into this non-alcoholic beer space, where we've got less than 0.5% ABV, is that technically everything in this category still falls under TTB purview. So in the CFR, you have malt beverages, not necessarily beer as the terminology that's used here, is defined as a fermented product containing a certain amount of malted barley and some form of hops. And it doesn't actually have a minimum ABV. So anything going into that category is actually still going to require TTB formula approval, depending on exactly what's going in it, and a certificate of label approval, even if you've got 0.0% ABV in it. It's pretty fascinating because non-alcoholic wine that we work a lot with, that's a total non-issue. It's an FDA product, FDA label, completely separate. But non-alcoholic beer, or if you're going to call it a malt beverage or near beer, the terminology can get a little tricky. You're still there dealing with the TTB. So that actually, again, it makes this a sort of complex product to pull off. Now, the production methods for actually making a non-alcoholic beer. There are 3 main ones that I'm going to dive into. We've got arrested fermentation, membrane filtration, and thin film vacuum distillation. And these are the 3 key categories that we're seeing in commercial use today. So dipping into each of these. Arrested fermentation, right? My goal here is to make either no or very little alcohol in the first place in this product. so that I don't need to deal with actually removing the alcohol later. So this is all about intentionally low attenuation. What that generally means is there are a couple different ways you're going to go about this, but if I'm making beer in a traditional manner and then just not actually fermenting any of this over, you're going to have a really high final gravity, lots of sugar content, tons of calories. It's going to be a sweet and viscous wort-like flavor profile. You're not actually going to get your traditional fermentation esters. A lot of the flavors you expect from beer, right, they don't actually appear until after fermentation. So you're going to have a product that's almost more like Malta Goya than it is an IPA, which consumers may or may not recognize or like. The other way we're seeing people go about something similar is using yeasts that have a adjusted metabolism, and they're going to produce way less of that ethanol end product. That's something where it's a bit of a crapshoot on quality again, depending on what you're working with. Because if I'm diverting the end product of ethanol and the yeast aren't going to reach that end product, you're going to end up with other things instead. Acetic acid is something that would be really common if I'm cutting the metabolic pathway of those yeast short and working with some different strain. Generally, you're going to get a set of different funky acids and aromatics that go along with it, almost like you're creating a different type of sour. Doing all of this too, it's important to remember that non-alcoholic beer, right? By definition, I've got less than 0.5% ABV, and alcohol's got some serious preservative action, at least microbially speaking. So if I'm going to have that high sugar left over in that beer, I've got a lot of extra risk for re-fermentation, which in any cannabis product or non-alcoholic product is bad, because if you go over 0.5% ABV, you can potentially get in quite a lot of trouble. That's a great way to lose your cannabis license, or have, exploding packages. There have been some nightmares early on in California, I would say, for some of the early leaders in the cannabis beer space, where they got a bad rap for having cans exploding on the shelves of retailers. Not a good way to get listed and increase your sales. The next method we're seeing a lot is membrane filtration, reverse osmosis kind of being the most common. We're seeing there are some other filters you can go down to even smaller than that. But effectively, you've got a semi-permeable membrane that the beer is running against. And using pressure, you're forcing molecules of certain sizes across that. One of the issues with it is it's generally got a limited selectivity, right? Anything underneath that certain size is going to kind of just be forced across it. But this is also a diffusion type process. So what that means is the more of any given particle type I force across that membrane, the more difficult it is to then force more across it. So it's something that can be effective for removing small amounts of a given substance like alcohol. But when I'm trying to go all the way down from 5% to 0.5%, for every percent of alcohol I'm removing from the beer, it's going to get even more difficult to remove the next percent. It's going to require more pressure and more time. And generally what that means is it's not a very scalable process. A lot of work I'd say we do with folks in Europe is actually taking them from membrane filtration processes and moving them over to thin film vacuum distillation processes, where their operation can actually scale up. The other issue that you're going to see with membrane filtration when you're using it is you're going to create a effluent. You've got a mix of alcohol, aroma compounds that were small enough, which is quite a lot of them, to pass through that membrane. and water. That is effectively the waste stream from your production. And it usually comes off as a fairly low proof. That could be 10 to 20% ABV, something like that, possibly lower, depending on how many concentration steps and time you're going to do to this. That you then need to figure out, well, what are you going to do with? So that's a fairly decent waste stream with quite a lot of water waste in it, which is also going to impact what is your actual product yield. And you need to take even more water and start adding that into your non-alcoholic beer to recover that quantity. So thin film vacuum distillation, and I'm going to admit I'm personally a bit biased. I think this is the best. It's the technology we like to work with. But this is all about separating these compounds by the boiling point. So what we're doing is traditional distillation, that's not going to cut it because that's going to expose everything to heat. Even if I am using a vacuum distillation method, just a regular vacuum distillation, you would still get a fairly high heat going there. But so what we like to do is we work with a set of technologies called thin film vacuum distillation. So not only are we pulling a vacuum, but we're creating a super high surface area. And by a couple of different methods, we create this really thin film. You're talking maybe like a millimeter thick of liquid going through a process at a given time. And what that means is that this can be done really quickly. So generally you're working at a temperature somewhere around the mid 40 degrees Celsius. And just in that temperature range with thin film vacuum distillation, you can remove all the alcohol from a beer or wine in something like 5 to 10 seconds. All while keeping it under an oxygen-free vacuum. And that quickness, one, means you can have quite a lot of throughput there, but it also is going to preserve your quality because you're minimizing any heat contact that's going into this. The other wonderful thing about thin film vacuum distillation technologies is that you can isolate your aromatic components to some extent from your alcohol. So what we commonly like to do when we're working with any substance is, depending on the technology, sometimes this is a prior step, or with the later technologies that we're using called the GOLO, it's actually all integrated as a single step process, which is fantastic. But you're running that product through first and separating off all those super volatile aromatics into a concentrated alcohol portion. You're then able to go all the way down as low as you'd like in terms of the alcohol content in the non-alcoholic beer, let's say to 0.0%, and then add back those aromatics up to 0.5%. And that's going to give you a really nice, authentic flavor profile. So you can take that fully fermented beer, whatever type really, let's say it's a Hefeweizen, you're going to be able to capture all those kind of really distinctive esters and re-add them back and have that profile. Whereas if you're going to try beers with either of the other methods in production, generally things are going to be a lot blander and less recognizable. In the case of arrested fermentation, you're usually not making those aromatics in the first place, or in the case of membrane filtration, you're losing them in that de-alcoholization process, and there's not really a good method to recover them. So that's personally what we recommend. Very happy to, if you're interested, either answer questions later or feel free to contact and reach out, and we're happy to discuss all the different methods, options. How do you make non-alcoholic beer? Now, just to look at what is this category of cannabis-infused beer and what's the opportunity here? There is a lot of press going into this. It's still actually one of the smaller products in the market, but it's got a tremendous opportunity. You're going to keep seeing press about it. You're going to keep seeing money pour into it. Figures are escaping me right now, but AB InBev has made some sizable investments, I believe, with Tilray. Molson Coors partnered with Truss for, I believe, quite a significant sum to work on cannabis beverage products. You've got Constellation. I believe they own Modelo, Corona, making a huge play in this space. They bought Canopy Growth, and you're going to start seeing those large Canadian investments making plays now in the US. Generally, they seem to be starting in Colorado right now. You're also going to keep seeing news about the share of cannabis beverages in the cannabis marketplace going up. The growth right now is starting to outpace the total cannabis market, and we're going to keep seeing that go up. So right now in a state like California, cannabis beverages are 1.2% or so of total retail sales, pretty much nothing. But I would expect when this market comes to maturity, you're easily talking 30% or so, and it's going to be one of the dominant form factors. And that's a massive opportunity and a lot of market share to capture that you don't necessarily have anyone capturing right now. So there's a lot of space for new brands to come in and play. A lot of reasons why that's a pretty good opportunity. Looking at brands right now, just in California, this is some great data from a company called Headset, where you can actually see the monthly growth for a number of different brands. And you can see that 3 years ago, you didn't have that many players. Right now, the entire market is diversifying. We've got a lot more brands going in, but it's also just growing exponentially. So there is plenty of room for more brands and plenty of room for brands to keep growing. You're going to see Lagunitas Brewing Company up there as one of the largest for sure. And what that tells us, actually alongside Can Social Tonics, both of these, especially Can, are kind of positioned as alcoholic beverage alternatives. And there is definitely a lot of consumer demand for that within the cannabis space. One of the other really interesting trends is we're seeing this matches some of the trends in the alcoholic beverage sector space, where you have folks that are interested in lower alcohol or no alcohol products. So Athletic Brewing, for example, Heineken 0.0 are taking off with some massive sales. What we're seeing is that really low dose category, 0 to 5 milligrams, is driving quite a lot of growth in beverage sales and taking up more of the market. You've got very high dose beverages in that 100 milligram plus range. Personally, I could not drink a single one of those. I think I might be stoned for 5 days straight. That's a bit much. But we're actually just seeing the market polarize and go between those two for the most part. The 100 milligram plus THC beverages are generally your old-fashioned consumer, more traditional, whereas the 0 to 5 milligram THC is your new cannabis consumers that are kind of just trying out these products and are looking for something friendly and sessionable. That's really where we're seeing anyone doing a beer or a beer analog product go. It makes sense. It's someone who's looking to enjoy their beverage, cares about the taste. Whereas that 100 milligram category, usually that's going to be, almost like an energy shot style, where someone's chugging that and that's it. They're not looking for another one. Flavor profile isn't that important. They're more focused on what is the cost of this. Now, the challenges and opportunities that are kind of unique to this are that producing any kind of cannabis beverage, it's going to require licensed space with packaging infrastructure. Beverages aren't cheap to make. They require a lot of equipment. Things like canning lines are not cheap investments, nor necessarily is the expertise required to run those. So traditional operators in the cannabis space, They don't have those. And actually building out spaces with something as simple as floor drains to be able to handle beverages is taking a surprising amount of time and expense. So that's part of why you're not seeing as many brands and there's room for a lot more, is because there are in every state, pretty limited facilities capable of producing them. Your existing cannabis players have a very hard time getting into that. And there's not very much, if any, co-packing available. There's some in certain states if you know people, but generally a difficult thing to find. One of the other challenges is currently distribution. Most cannabis products have a very high value and very low weight, kind of the opposite of beverages. Your flower or your vape cartridges, some concentrate products, all that, again, low weight, high value, and primarily it gets moved around in sprinter vans. So what that means is when you start trying to get a distributor for a beverage product, or even just warehousing space, this is a new struggle for a lot of the existing players. So that infrastructure, the actual physical space and transport means, is taking a little bit of time to catch up. It's starting to get there. There's a lot more investment being made into it. But because of that need for state licensing, you can't really use anything existing. That's part of the actually most fantastic thing to me about this category, is that means that really established companies, your really large beverage players, don't actually have that much of an advantage over you because they can't leverage their existing infrastructure, which is, one of their biggest values. So all of a sudden, if you launch a product into this field, you've got a level playing field. Similarly, tying into that are actually the retail outlets. Generally, in most states, it's entirely small independents. Now, it can make it tough to move a lot of volume because these guys, which will actually include your direct-to-consumer delivery, you're going to have a limited number. Let's say California, I think we're only at 600 or 700 right now. And your sales tactics, you're going after either independent stores or fairly small collections of them. So that does take a bit of manpower. But again, it means you're not dealing with a Walmart or a large retailer that's going to have that much negotiating leverage over you, which makes a more level playing field for new brands to get in, establish themselves. And once this actually goes federally legal, you're probably going to have opportunities to cash out. The next big challenges are cannabis consumer education. Not enough folks actually just know that beverages exist or as an option. The technology to really do this wasn't readily commercially available until a couple of years ago. So it's really a new type of product that people are just learning about now. That's part of why it's a small market share at the moment, but it's also why we see this, it's going to keep growing faster and faster because that's going to hit critical mass eventually, and consumer education is kind of going to take care of itself. But right now, it's a little bit slower and one of those challenges. But you're going to keep seeing more and more about it, and that category is going to grow. And the last piece is actually interstate commerce. You can't take these products over state lines because it's not federally legal. Now, while that is a challenge, you can't make something in California and then sell that in Colorado unless you produce it completely separately in Colorado. But it also, again, means that I can't just create a large brand in one state and then push out and roll over and take advantage of economies of scale. It's setting up shop again in another state to expand it. So that means as new states come online, they're pretty much brand new opportunities that you can take advantage of and launch a brand in that space and establish yourself. And you've got some level of protection from larger players just swooping in right away. So I know that's quite a lot. We covered a lot of different things there. But if anyone's got any questions, I would be more than happy to answer something the little time we've got remaining. So what that means with existing infrastructure that you can't use is you're not going to be able to use your bonded brewery to actually infuse and can something, because in any state, you're going to be required to have a cannabis licensed premise, which inherently is going to be incompatible with your TTB bonded brewery. Pretty much just meaning, while it's federally illegal, you're not going to be able to get the state license for that illegal product. So you will need to either have generally what we're seeing people do is actually take their product brewed at a bonded brewery and then have it de-alcoholized, and you need to figure out a way to transport it to a licensed facility where you're actually going to infuse and package. The ideal situation, if possible, is a pipeline so that you've got the least oxygen exposure. Otherwise, we've actually heard of people doing things as crazy and not so good for quality as actually bottling their product and then uncapping it, dosing every bottle individually, and then recapping it. Obviously, that's going to be some risk for oxidation. So Jason Shiflett, I'm hoping that answered your question there, where you need that separate license premise. So ideally, you can either take that product over 0.5% and move it by pipeline to a licensed facility, or you're going to have to figure out some other mechanism of actually transporting it. Well, if you guys don't have any other questions, happy 420, everyone. Enjoy the day. And please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to connect and discuss whether it's about a cannabis-infused product, hemp-infused product, or non-alcoholic beer in general. Cheers, guys.